Hey, happy weavers, and welcome to a joint Dueling Rabbits Joanne Hall production. I'm your host, Amy, here to talk about transforming a conventional Swedish-style countershed loom into a double harness setup for weaving twill damask. Weaving with long heddles, half-heddle sticks, and a weaving sword is a great introduction to double harness weaving and expands the capabilities of a conventional loom in remarkable ways. Here I am, weaving away on my 135 centimeter Glamocra standard loom. It's configured with 4 shafts in a straight threading and 4 treadles with just 2 connections each. The cloth I'm weaving looks like this, a simple 3-1 twill damask pattern in 4 blocks. I should say deceptively simple, because on a conventional single harness loom, this pattern would require 16 shafts and 16 treadles, not to mention 256 tie-ups. On my loom, which maxes out at 10 shafts, this setup is not possible. So how am I weaving this impossible cloth? The 2 half-heddle sticks you see between the shafts and the back beam give me the ability to manipulate units of warp ends however I want. They've turned my conventional loom into something really, really powerful. It's pretty exciting, so let's see how it all works. Here's the drawdown for Joanne's pattern, which we are setting up and weaving today. We have 336 warp ends in total. Since our structure is 3-1 twill, our units have 4 threads each. 336 threads at 4 threads per unit gives us 84 units in total across the warp. Our pattern is divided into 2 parts. Part 1 consists of the 2 blocks in our main monk's belt-like motif. Block 1 is here, and block 2 is here. We'll need 1 half-heddle stick for each of these blocks. Part 2 of the pattern also consists of 2 blocks, but we don't need any more sticks for these. This blue column is achieved by threading units onto both half-heddle sticks. The white column is woven with units that are not threaded onto either. We'll talk more about this in a minute when we get underway. First, let's consider the hardware that we'll need to transform our loom. Our shafts must be refitted with long heddles in order for the damask shed to operate correctly. My loom is a Glamocra standard, so I'm using my draw loom heddles, but other looms may require heddles of different lengths. Because each shaft has only 2 connections, we'll need a mechanism of some kind to return the shafts to neutral when needed. Buttonhole elastics like these are a common solution. I've got 8 elastics here, 2 for each of my shafts. They can be hung from the countermarch or counterbalance beam with simple lengths of Texolve. Next comes a pickup stick for selecting warp units off the least sticks at the back beam. I've got a stick for my old rigid heddle loom, but anything vaguely smooth or pointy will work. Here are my 2 half-heddle sticks. I've no idea what they are, I just found them in the basement. I drilled holes in the ends so I could rig up safety strings, but if you don't want to go to the trouble, you can use masking tape on warping sticks instead. The sticks should be a few inches longer than your warp is wide. Here are some ordinary heddles for attaching the units to the half-heddle sticks, and finally, my weaving sword. This is a traditional sword with beveled edges and a rounded point, but any sort of batten will do, as long as it's a little bit longer than your warp is wide, thick enough to stand on edge by itself, and up to 4 inches wide. We'll examine the use of all these accoutrements in due course. First, let's wind the warp. I'm using 8-2 cotton for mine. 336 ends wound in a 4x4 cross. This is going to make life pretty easy down the road for 2 reasons. First, our straight threading on our 4 shafts becomes an almost foolproof exercise, since every group of 4 threads corresponds to 1 threading repeat. Second, it will be very easy to count units when it comes time to select our pattern with the pickup stick. Much more on that a bit later on. I beamed my warp as usual, and now here I am, sitting inside the loom threading the long heddles on their 4 shafts. The eyes of these heddles are so easy to see and wrangle, this job goes very quickly. I'm working from the first shaft at the back to the 4th shaft in front in a straight threading. For each group of 4 threads coming off the cross, it's a simple 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 ad nauseum. If you've seen any of my draw loom videos, this will remind you of threading the ground shafts, which is in effect exactly what I'm doing. I'll continue threading back to front 1, 2, 3, 4 until I reach the end of my warp. I slay my reed as normal. A set of 24 ends per inch is probably about right for our 4-end twill. I'm threading 2 per dent in a 50-10 metric reed, which will be slightly closer than that. We use what we've got, and your mileage may vary. When that's done, I tie onto the cloth beam and congratulate myself on a job well and efficiently done. Now, let's look at the loom from the side. Here we are, examining the shafts with the warp traveling through the long Half-Heddles. The shafts are currently at the same height they would be if I were using my standard Heddles. Even though the warp is traveling through the center of the reed in a straight line from the back beam to the breast beam, it's not quite what I want. The warp is passing through the Heddles close to the tops of the long eyes. As a good starting point, the warp should be passing through the middle of them, like this. So I raise all the shafts, shortening their chords by a couple of centimeters. There, that's better. I'll probably have to fine-tune things when I start weaving, but this is good enough for now. It lets me get on with my tie-ups anyway. Now we're sitting inside the loom behind the lambs. Here's my tie-up diagram showing the columns for the 4 treadles and the rows for the 4 shafts. X's indicate tie-ups to sinking shafts, the O's to rising shafts. The blank squares show where there are no connections at all. Let's look at the X's on the short lambs first. Remember, short lambs sink. Each of my black beads corresponds to a connection to a sinking shaft. When I'm weaving, I will cycle through my treadles, lowering only 1 shaft at a time. If I were using my Damask pulleys, these would be the only connections I'd need, since the counteraction of the pulleys would take care of the rising shafts. But since I'm using my countermarch, I also need connections to my long lambs. Remember, long lower lambs lift. My white beads correspond to the O's on my diagram. As I cycle through my treadles, I will lift only 1 shaft at a time. With only 2 connections per treadle, merely stepping on the next will not return the raised and lowered shafts to neutral. We need to rig our elastics to ensure weavable sheds. Here are the 4 elastics on the right side of the loom, 1 on each shaft, but hung on a single piece of Texsolve that's looped over the countermarch. The arrangement is mirrored on the other side. The elastics are hung so they almost, but not quite, raise the shafts from their resting position. The loom looks pretty good. If this were a single harness setup, we'd be ready to start weaving. But since we want to produce patterns on our cloth, we need to set up our half-heddle sticks. Let's revisit Joanne's Drawdown. This is the side of the cloth that faces up when we are weaving. The blue squares and columns represent warp emphasis blocks woven when units are raised, and the white squares and columns represent weft emphasis blocks woven on unraised units. Our drawdown shows the distribution of the 84 units on the 2 half-heddle sticks here at the bottom. Since the blue squares represent raised units, we can see this threading here corresponds to the section here, and this to this. To prepare our half-heddle sticks, we're going to stand at the back of the loom and select warp units according to this plan. Let's consider the first stick. The numbers will help with the selection of our units. We'll begin by passing over the 5 units at the selvage. Remember, that's 20 threads. We'll pick up the next 2 units, but skip the next 6. Pick up 4, skip 2. Pick up 4 again, skip 6. Pick up 2, and so on, all the way across the warp. Time for our second stick. We'll skip the 5 selvage units as before, and pick up the next 2. Skip 2, pick up 4. Skip 4, pick up 2. Skip 4, pick up 4, skip 2, and so on until we're done. Now that we're armed with this information, we're ready to head to the loom and do the necessaries. I'm standing at the back of the loom, surveying the warp where it comes off the least sticks at the back beam. I've got the warp tensioned pretty well and have my pickup stick at hand. I refer to the threading order for stick number 1 and prepare to count at the cross. I see that I can skip the first 5 units and pick up the next 2. Done. I count off the next 6 and skip those. Count up the next 4 and pick them up. Skip 2 and pick up 4, always counting at the cross. Now, everybody has their own way of doing this, but I think I've got a pretty neat trick for long or unfamiliar sequences. Instead of referring to a diagram where I almost inevitably lose my place, I make a voice recording on my phone. Skip 2, pick up 4, skip 6, pick up 2. I listen as I work and follow along. For me personally, it speeds things up and improves accuracy by a lot. Pretty soon, I'm done. I'm relieved to discover I've got 5 units left at the selvage, and it looks good. When I turn my stick on edge, I can tell at a glance that my selection of units is symmetrical. Now it's time to construct my half-heddle stick. I insert my weaving sword into the shed to give myself a good background against which to see my units more clearly. I take my first half-heddle stick with its safety string untied and lay that conveniently by. I grab a bunch of standard heddles and get to work. I take my first heddle and pass it under the first 2 units on the pickup stick. I fold the heddle in half and loop it over my stick. I take another heddle and pass it under the next group of 4 units. Fold it in half and loop it over the stick. I continue all the way across the warp, picking up units and groups until I have all 10 heddles on my stick. I check to make sure my units are free and that I haven't missed any errant threads. I reattach my safety string and push the whole lot towards the beater. I remove the sword and pickup stick and steel myself for the next selection. For the second stick, I skip the 5 selvage units as before and pick up the next 2. After that, I'll pick up units according to the plan on the threading diagram for the second stick. Skip 2, pick up 4, skip 4, and so on, listening to the soothing sound of my own voice as it talks me through the sequence. Soon I'm finished and ready to construct my second half-heddle stick. When that's done and its safety string is firmly secured, I push it toward the beater to join its companion. We're now ready to test our setup by weaving some 3-1 twill damask. You'll notice when you first press a treadle that you've got 2 sheds to deal with, an upper shed and a lower shed. This is absolutely normal and nothing at all to be concerned about. Remember, every time we press a treadle, 1 in 4 warp ends is going up, 2 in 4 are remaining stationary, and 1 in 4 is going down. You're seeing that in action now. If I throw my shuttle in the upper shed and cycle through my treadles, I will get the basic 3-1 twill structure with the weft emphasis side facing up. You can see the natural linen predominates in this section here. If I throw my shuttle through the lower shed and cycle through my treadles, I'll get the warp emphasis face of the basic structure, giving me predominantly green cloth here. For this project, when no units are pulled, we'll be weaving through the top shed for a weft emphasis face. The lift plan for our piece is shown here at the right-hand side of the draft, where you would normally find the treadling sequence. The rightmost column represents the half-heddle stick, which is closest to the beater. I'm calling that stick stick number 1. When I lift that stick and treadle 1 through 4, I will get this row here. The left-hand column represents stick number 2, the one closer to the loom's back beam. Weaving with this stick raised gives me this row here. If I lift both sticks to weave, I'll get this warp emphasis horizontal stripe. If no sticks are raised, I'll get my weft emphasis face across the piece. We'll start here at the bottom and weave our way up so that the cloth on the loom appears exactly the same as the drawdown. We'll begin by lifting both our half-heddle sticks. I take up both the sticks and slide the weaving sword into the resulting shed, being careful to pass over all the unraised units. Then I turn the sword on its side to save the raised units. You'll want to experiment to find where the placement of the sword gives you an optimal shed. On this loom, about 7 inches behind the beater seems to work well. We've just done something really clever. We have created the conditions for the same damask shed that is used on draw looms. Where units are raised, treadling will lower one warp end in 4, giving a warp-faced appearance to the associated blocks. Where units are unraised, 1 in 4 ends is going up, giving us weft-faced blocks. It's cool. The operation of the weaving sword means that when we are weaving with units raised, pressing on a treadle gives us only one shed through which to pass our shuttle. You can see what's happening from our vantage point when weaving. All the units below the card will weave with the natural color of the linen weft predominating. The units above the card will weave in green. Now that I've got my sword in place, I'm going to throw my 4 picks while cycling through my treadles from left to right. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see the horizontal stripe taking shape. But we want to weave to square, and I can judge that by looking at this block here. Remember that it's 2 units, or 8 threads wide. I need to treadle my sequence again, 1, 2, 3, 4, and throw 4 more picks. There, 8 picks, and I've got a good square. We're weaving twill damask with only 4 treadles and no draw loom. Back to the drawdown we go. Now we're here. I see there are no sticks raised for this next section. That means I need to remove my weaving sword. With no units raised, it's time to treadle 8 more picks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's looking pretty good so far. Now we can start our main 2-block pattern. I check the drawdown and confirm that this first section is woven by lifting the units on half-heddle stick 1, closest to the beater. The best way to carry out this maneuver is whatever works for you. On this loom with just 2 half-heddle sticks, I find simply standing up and reaching over the beater works well. If there's a quick change, I don't bother returning to my bench and treadle standing up. Sometimes it can make more sense to walk to the side of the loom and lift from there. Try different ways of doing it until you find out what's most comfortable. Here I am weaving away on the first section of the pattern. These blocks are 4 units, that is 16 threads, wide. That means I'll need 16 picks to make them square. So I will treadle my sequence of 1 through 4 times, leaving half-heddle stick 1 raised the entire time. This goes pretty fast. Time to weave the next section here. I can see I will need to swap half-heddle stick 1 for half-heddle stick 2. By keeping the first stick in front of the sword and the second stick behind it, it's easy to keep track of what I'm doing. I make the change and weave 16 more picks. A quick consultation with the drawdown shows it's time to swap my half-heddle sticks again. Dum 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 dum, and there we go. But this section is only half as tall as the others, so I weave just 8 picks with the units on stick number 1 raised. Look at that, we're already halfway through our pattern. I'm ready to swap sticks again and work myself out the other side. In no time at all, I find myself ready to lift both half-heddle sticks for the green stripe at the other end of the pattern. I remove the weaving sword and treadle 8 more picks with no units raised. That sets me up to weave the pattern's second half. I follow the lift plan, raising my half-heddle sticks accordingly until I'm all done. Now we've got some choices. We can repeat the pattern for a mat or a runner, or change things up by selecting new blocks and adding additional sticks. You can rank them down the warp until you run out of room, labeling each one with a memorable name to help keep track as you weave. I've decided to have some fun. I drilled holes in 4 more half-heddle sticks, fired up my weaving software, marked out 84 squares, and got to designing. I hope you will too.